we can take our, you can just stay who you are and ask questions.
Okay. My name is Dick Andrus, and I'm not representing, but I'm from Binghamton University in Broome County, New York. I'm actually opposed to the policy of our university, which is to do nothing but let the deer destroy the forest. My question is about incentives. What do you do about institutional lands where there's no economic incentive?
You know,
The only one I can come up with is just ethical. And ethical carries about as much weight as almost nothing.
You know, the ethic that Aldo Leopold always espoused, some people are going to do the right thing for conservation, and it's not going to take any kind of monetary incentive to do it. Another incentive is one leading through example, showing people that as a institution we can do the right things.
okay, if these are ecological slums, which they are, then they are managed by slumlords. And if you draw the parallel to the 1960s inner cities, what did it take? Did those slumlords, on their own, out of the goodness of their heart, decide to clean up the slums? No, it was community speaking out against it. It was new laws enacted. So they were forced to clean up their act, which probably had good economic reasons down the road.
I'd like to add to that. I think that the New York City slums are a great example, and want to highlight two important points. One, a lot of the slums in New York City were government projects, and two, they were privately owned apartment buildings that were under rent control. So when the government restricts ability of landowners to make profits off of their land for a particular activity, then they're not going to have the same incentive. So during the 1970s, 300,000 apartments were abandoned, taken off the market. So the same amount of apartments as in the entire city of San Francisco were taken off the market in New York. And I think it's the same thing. We don't have the same incentives to get people involved when you can't make money. So David, I loved your idea, and I think it can work on government land. But I do think if you add in the extra incentive to say, hey, SUNY Binghamton, you can actually maybe make some money by renting this out, that might change the factor. But at the end of the day, government agency, especially government university, is not going to be responding to a profit motive the same way a private person will.
In my experience, academic communities are hotbeds of anthropomorphism. They don't want to kill stuff. They have grown up as denatured as any one particular group that I know of. And none of the arguments that people used to make against overabundant deer populations had much resonance. The ecological damage that Tom has been talking about all over the East began to resonate several years ago. And I think the whole idea of ecological slums is a really good one. And you're essentially shaming these people into believing that what they're doing is bad and that they have a stewardship responsibility. But that's not an easy sell, and it's going to take time.
I'm Mac White. I'm from Marbletown in Ulster County. I wonder if you have an opinion whether the DEC has an unreasonable motivation for selling hunting licenses and therefore has a motivation to keep the deer herd large. My land has a clear browse line, far too many ferns. I mean, the ferns are surely proliferating over the years, over the last 20 years. And I can't get the DMP, or deer management permit, many years. You know, there may be a lot of hunters asking for them, but it seems to me not enough.
How many times have you been visited by one of their field biologists?
Never.
Okay, that's your first problem. That's why in Texas we have lots of people that is their sole responsibility. I don't believe that state agencies try to intentionally keep deer populations high so they can sell more hunting license and stuff. I don't believe that's charged by any state agency. I think there's just a lack of manpower in a lot of those agencies that just aren't getting out.
So here's what I believe the case to be. Generations ago, when the main constituency for the wildlife agencies were trappers and hunters and anglers, then that model of funding worked, where the license revenue of somebody who wanted to shoot something or catch something, there was enough of those people that it could generate enough revenue to drive the budget for the agency. Nowadays, again, it's a demographic issue. There's fewer and fewer people hunting, there's fewer and fewer people trapping for sure, but what has occurred, unfortunately, is that each agency is trying to squeeze that dollar from license revenue tighter and tighter each year, because each year there's fewer and fewer people buying their license. And so why not pay for something like that? But this model where the consumers, the hunters, anglers, and fishers, hunters, trappers, and anglers are paying for wildlife management is insane. It doesn't work anymore. So let's get away from that. And then if we can get away from that model, then we're not tied to advocacy groups, and we're not tied to politicization. We can actually do research-based management, which is what we should be doing in the first place.
My name is Todd Bittner. I'm the Natural Areas Director at Cornell Plantations. I run a deer management program to preserve and safeguard Cornell University's outdoor classrooms. We had over 10,000 acres in our lands last year under deer management, 1,600 hunters. I was interested in the panel about other ideas and approaches, how to balance liability protections with generated revenue. And then a second question for David about deer management and the USDA requirements, how we get beyond having the inspection issue with animals that are harvested in the field,
Right.
when all the rest of the USDA facilities all require it to be in certified facilities.
Yeah, that is a tough first question, because, in some places, you don't have to have the insurance to cover. You're not required to have the insurance unless your income revenue is twice your ad valorem taxes for that piece of property. So I don't know what it is here, but insurance is always an issue. If I'm going to make this much, why are my insurance costs exceeding that? What's the point then in trying to do it? So it's a tough question.
It does show this bias, I think, that a lot of people have against making money, that if you do it for free, it's okay. If you do it for money, it's bad. And so they're putting a huge subsidy on one activity but not on the other, and that's changing prices, relative prices, tremendously, and that's going to have interferences with the market.
I will always have an answer for something. So the first question is, many states have that law where if you allow people to come onto the property, you are held harmless from a liability standpoint, as long as you don't receive some service. And again, from a hunting standpoint, if I were to give the landowner a part of the backstrap, then that would violate that law. But the reason they do it in the states is to provide access, not necessarily for hunting, but it's access for hiking and bird watching and letting Girl Scout and Boy Scout groups camp on the property. It's to incentivize the landowner to open up the land.
Right.
There's other state programs, for example, and we have this in Wisconsin. It's called managed forest law, and it's a tax law where you get taxed at a lower rate for forest land than you do for if it was non-forest land or commercial land. And there's two stratifications to that. So one is if you want to pay higher taxes, you don't have to allow people on your property. But if you want to pay lower taxes, you have to. It's open to managed forest law, so you have to allow people to come on your property, hunt, and things like that. So there's different ways that these are structured. But regardless, that there are also, and I know this is the case in Texas. I was down in Texas for graduate school, and I know this is the case in most other states that have private lands, is if you want to lease your property, everybody will tell you up front that you need to have a good legal contract in place. So what you were referring to is USDA, they inspect and certify facilities, that are brick and mortar facilities. But there are exceptions where if you shoot an animal that inspector will come into the field. So once the animal is dropped in the field, that inspector will come to the field, and they are legally allowed to inspect the animal in the field. But you have to have enough animals typically to make it worth the inspector's time to come out there. And as I understand it, the inspector is not necessarily required to do that. So they can do it out of the goodness of their heart if they wish to do it, but they're not required to do that. So that is a possibility of a way to get around there. But I think typically, if we want to make this a valid model, we really want to work within the confines of the mainstream regulations, and we just need to figure out how best to do that.
Charles Stackhouse from the Finger Lakes. I think most of us in this room would believe we have a deer overpopulation problem, but I doubt that many of the people who hunt deer in New York think that. How do you practically get that education out? Other than everybody being mandated to read your book, Jim, how do you mandate to the public? Because currently the way the DEC sets their harvest, they have these meetings with the Federation of Sportsmen's Clubs, and it's a very opaque process. It's not a habitat-driven, scientific-based process for what the habitat can support for setting the deer management goals. But how do you even start to make any of these solutions possible without educating the public?
If they get away from that, the historic funding model, where the people buying the licenses are funding the program, then they don't have to worry about what does the constituency group think. The reason they're doing it is because they don't want to piss the constituency group off because they can't afford them not buying the licenses. And it's that simple.
Imagine if all chickens were not privately owned and they roamed the land freely and you couldn't sell them and you couldn't make money off of them. And so the only way you could get a chicken is to go out in the wild and hope you found one. If you're a forager, a hunter of chickens, you're going to want to have tons and tons of chickens. Well, that might be good for you and your constituency, but it might not be good for the environment. And the chicken consumer might have more chicken if we privatized it rather than having it done on government property.
I'm Chris Sempitas, president of Bevan Forestry Incorporated. I'm a consulting forester. I'm also a student of wildlife biology. How do we go to the next step where we apply science before the social element so that we can merge this, not just merge our professions as resource managers, but merge the social need, because we have an educational hold up here. Most of the public does not understand what the ecology needs, what they need. Wildlife biologists, no offense, don't always understand the large economic picture. Do you actually see a scientific approach occurring here in New York for deer management?
I think to some extent there's a lot of wildlife management is people management, but part of the problem I think is a larger societal issue is we science has become a bad word in our society. I mean, if you want to look at climate change, whether you believe it or not, we cannot have a rational discussion about something like climate change because the science has been so dirtied and bloodied that, and anything else, science is a bad word. And so when you start talking about science, a lot of people automatically start backing off because either they're intimidated by that word or they don't agree. So I think it's just generally we have to do a better job of educating the public about science and about science-based things and things like that. There's a whole lot of other things too. I mean, people, it's that disconnect behind nature. We've got, as we've talked about, most of the East at least is privately owned. But if you look at the number of people who actually live on the land they own, it's a small number. We've got a lot of absentee land ownership, and when you're not there to take care of something or monitor something or watch it, evolve, it's hard to understand that as well.
When it comes to educating the public about wildlife and wildlife issues, how do you make those issues relevant to somebody in an urban society that lives in the concrete jungle? How do we turn that around? It's kind of like he was saying earlier, this North American model is so ingrained in the fish and game agencies. That is what they believe. Nothing wrong with that. But we also have to recognize maybe it's time for a change. Maybe it needs some tweaking, some additional tenets that we could add to that to make it even stronger and more valuable and more relevant to people in today's current society. That's a tough one to do. People believe in that so strong because that's what when they came to the New World, that's what they were running away from. They were running away from the king's rule. of owning the land and owning all the wildlife on it. They came to a new world and started doing something different. Now everybody owns it. Not one man, but all men. So it's hard to change mindsets once they're already mixed, and kind of like concrete, mix it up and they're already set.
You know, even though something is ingrained, you have to look at it with a critical eye and have an analytical mind to it, and you have to be willing to say, hey, maybe, you know, this is what I've always grown up believing, but maybe I need to take a step back and look at this objectively. And we just don't do a very good job of teaching critical thinking skills in this country, unfortunately.
Instead of shooting for the moon and talking about commercialization of deer meat and all that, the North American model, correct me if I'm wrong, prohibits one from using animals for barter. Is that correct?
If it's commercialized.
Well, you know, bartering in the country, folks, bartering takes place all the time. I had a neighbor who's good at carpentry. He said he'd help me fix my roof if I could get him a deer, give him a whole deer. So there's this, not exactly a black market, but according to the North American model, that is bartering, and for some reason, that is also illegal, immoral, or whatever. But in the free market system, buyer beware. Don't we all live with that? So, you know, if I'm trading a hindquarter for a bushel of apples that my neighbor has, you know, buyer beware. So isn't that a great frontier that's already happening? I can guarantee you, people are bartering the crap out of everything to try to beat the system.
Steve Rich, we've got a house up here, small acreage. You know, we're in a unique situation up here because unlike the East, the Catskills, the Adirondacks, really the majority is publicly owned, and the private lands are kind of few and far between. And we were talking a little bit about lunch and, you know, the idea of the tragedy of the commons, but, you know, we also have that, we have that issue here, but we also have the free rider problem. You know, if we go to improve our land in terms of forestry habitat, especially if we're avid deer hunters, there are a lot of people who will take benefit from that. And I wonder if you guys can think of any levers that we can pull to try and get the New York City, you know, people to manage their lands. I mean, in my mind, it's kind of simple: healthy forest, healthier herd, healthier water, because it's going to do a better job of filtering. But if you have any comments on that?
You know, there are friends groups for public lands and things like that where people take ownership. I mean, not legal ownership, but they have a personal affinity and a relationship with that property, and maybe kind of a friends group. But the more people you can get to take ownership in that property, the more that property is going to get taken care of.
Even the national parks, Acadia National Park has a group that my wife is an officer of called Friends of Acadia, and they raise a lot of money. They do a lot of improving of the trails and volunteer work in the park, and as a result, they have an enormous amount of leverage, an inordinate amount of leverage with the National Park Service, which works at a local level